This is a University of Otago podcast.
No mai haere mai, rangi marie kia koutou. Peace to you all. My name's Richard Jackson, and I'm the Acting Director at the National Centre for Peace and Conflict Studies, and I'm also a member of the Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust. And on behalf of the Chair of the Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust, Professor Kevin Clements, who unfortunately is overseas at the moment and cannot join us, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the second Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust lecture. The Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust was formed to promote peace education and peace studies at all levels of the community. Specifically, it has three aims. First of all, to organise an annual peace lecture to be given in Archibald Baxter's name, which is the lecture tonight, and we are very pleased that the lecture can be held today, which is the International Day of Peace as mandated by the United Nations. Secondly, to promote an essay competition in Otago schools on the topic of peace and non-violence. And later this evening, we will be presenting this year's prizes and awards for those essays. And then thirdly, and perhaps most importantly, the Trust was established to get together and bring into reality a physical memorial in Dunedin to remember all those conscientious objectors in New Zealand who stood for peaceful alternatives to conflict and war. And I'm delighted to say that progress on that is well advanced, and the Trust is now raising funds to see the project through to completion. Now, for those of you who might not be aware, Archibald Baxter is New Zealand's best-known conscientious objector and the father of the poet James K. Baxter. Archibald Baxter steadfastly endured the suffering, what we would now understand today as torture, caused by his decision to reject military service during the First World War. Transported to France and exposed to the horrors of frontline warfare, Archie and his fellow objectors have left New Zealand a legacy of principled resistance to war that is today more relevant than ever in our conflict-ridden world. And his book, We Will Not Cease, in which he describes his treatment and explains the reasons for his opposition to war, continues to be sold and continues to inspire war objectors and peacemakers today. So I'm delighted today to introduce Professor David Toombs, who is the Howard Patterson Chair in Theology and Public Issues, and he's the Director of the Centre for Theology and Public Issues here at the University of Otago. He has a long-standing interest in the contribution of religious faith to social justice and political change, as well as the complex relationship between religion and violence. Before joining us in New Zealand recently, he worked in London and then Belfast, and he's also carried out research in El Salvador, South Africa, and Sri Lanka. So please welcome our second annual lecturer for the Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust, Professor Toombs.
Thank you, Richard, and it's a pleasure to be here. My thanks to the Trust for their invitation to present the 2015 Archibald Baxter Peace Lecture, and my thanks to all of you for being here. Some of you will know Archibald Baxter much better than myself. As a relative newcomer, it's been a great privilege to be learning this story. If you're not familiar with him, I do commend the book that Richard mentioned, We Will Not Cease. It's a fascinating story of a man's courage in an extremely difficult situation. This evening, what I will be speaking about, at least to begin with, is the US Senate Intelligence Committee report on torture published last year, which strongly criticised the interrogation program overseen by the CIA in the aftermath of 9/11. And I hope to connect this to studies of torture practices under authoritarian regimes in Latin America that I'd studied previously, and then suggest to you that it's relevant to the field punishment of Archibald Baxter and other principled conscience objectors in World War I. So to start with the Senate report. On 3rd December 2014, the findings and executive summary of the US Senate Intelligence Report on Torture were finally declassified and released. The report documents the abuses and countless mistakes made between late 2001 and early 2009. Dianne Feinstein, the chair of the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence, notes in her foreword to the declassified documents, on April 3rd, 2014, the Senate Select Committee on Intelligence voted to send the findings and conclusions and the executive summary of its final study on the CIA's detention interrogation program to the President for declassification and subsequent public release. This action marked the culmination of a monumental effort that officially began with the committee's decision to initiate the study in March 2009, but which had its roots in an investigation into the CIA's destruction of videotapes of CIA detainee interrogations that began in December 2007. In the process, from early 2009 to late 2012, a small group of committee staff reviewed more than 6 million pages of CIA materials. This included operational cables, intelligence reports, internal memoranda, emails, briefing materials, interview transcripts, contracts, and other records. The declassified parts of the report quickly became widely available on the internet and as an e-book. The full committee study, which totals more than 6,700 pages, remains classified, but is now an official Senate report. It drew, as I said, on more than 6 million pages of CIA materials. For the sake of clarity, when I speak of the report this evening, unless indicated otherwise, what I mean is the 524 declassified pages of the report, which covers the foreword, 6 pages, the findings, 19 pages, and the executive summary, 499 pages. And just in case you haven't had a chance to read these yet, I've done a 2-page summary of the findings, which hopefully some of you have got. Also, for clarity, the use of the term torture is, of course, disputed by some. And for political reasons, the CIA and Republican White House at the time consistently avoided the term and used the euphemistic language of enhanced interrogation. This euphemism, and the misleading distinction it promoted, enabled the CIA and the administration to claim that they rejected torture in principle and in practice, whilst at the same time sanctioning the use of torture techniques against suspects in the so-called War on Terror. The Office of Legal Counsel provided legal arguments to support this distinction, but the report insists that the program involved torture. It indicates that of the 119 known detainees of the program, at least 39 were tortured by the CIA, and in at least 6 cases, the CIA used torture on suspects before evaluating whether they would be willing to cooperate. The sheer size and scale of the report probably mean that it will not be read as widely as it should. But it is a truly remarkable document. It is correctly described as monumental. But this should be seen as a recognition of not just its size and scale, but also because it deserves to be a long-standing monument and reminder for a particularly disturbing period in history. One of the most striking features of the report is that whilst it makes public a lot of specific information and detail on the CIA program for the first time, in some ways it does not tell us anything new about torture. To a quite extraordinary extent, it confirms the same lessons that have been learnt and reported about torture in many other places. As Feinstein notes in the foreword, the CIA themselves already knew these lessons. As the study describes, she says, prior to the attacks of September 2001, the CIA itself determined from its own experience with coercive interrogations that such techniques, quote, do not produce intelligence. Quote again, will probably result in false answers. She there is quoting what the CIA itself said, and had historically proven to be ineffective. Yet these conclusions were ignored, she points out. The Senate report confirms, in the same way that other reports, inquiries, and academic literature on torture in other contexts in recent decades have also shown that, in fact, the CIA was correct in its initial assessment. Torture does not produce intelligence, at least in the sense of an accurate, reliable, actionable form of intelligence. With this in mind, it's worth looking at the findings in a bit more detail. The 20 findings indicate a number of failures, which might be grouped as follows. First and foremost, ineffectiveness. The CIA program was not an effective instrument for actionable intelligence. That, I would say, is the primary finding of the report. Second, along with ineffectiveness, misrepresentation. The CIA misrepresented its findings to oversight bodies. These include the Department of Justice, finding 5, Congress, finding 6, the White House, finding 7, the CIA Inspector General, finding 9, by repeatedly overstating the program's effectiveness and value, finding 2, and understating its brutality and nature, finding 3 and finding 4, and the CIA also misled the media, finding 10. Third, mismanagement. The CIA was unprepared to carry out the program effectively, finding 11. Its management of the program was deeply flawed, finding 12 and finding 13. And it subcontracted the program to 2 external consultants, finding 15. It failed to evaluate the effectiveness of the techniques used, finding 16. It rarely held personnel accountable for serious and significant violations or systemic and individual failures, finding 17. It ignored numerous internal critiques and objections, finding 18. Furthermore, in addition to these 3 main criticisms, ineffective, misrepresented, and mismanaged, the enhanced techniques approved as part of the program, in addition to the enhanced techniques approved as part of the program, there were also coercive techniques which had not been approved by the Department of Justice or CIA headquarters and yet were still used, finding 14. The program was inherently unsustainable and short-sighted, finding 19. And the program impeded the mission of other agencies, finding 9, and damaged the standing of the US in the world, which resulted in significant monetary and non-monetary costs. In light of this, the fact that the report does not tell us something new about the value of torture does not mean that it's unimportant. I would suggest the contrary. By confirming well-known lessons in relation to the CIA's program from 2001 to 2006, the report does more than just uphold the important principles that the CIA and White House chose to deliberately denigrate, dismiss, and obfuscate. It's worth reading because it provides such a thorough and compelling evidence base for the common sense arguments that critics of torture often wish to make, but which they cannot always give documented evidence for. For example, the objections that torture produces false, useless, or unreliable information. In cases where torture has been sanctioned, there has invariably been a rapid spread of torture practices used and the targets that they applied to beyond the initial policy. Or the use of torture contaminates the justice system. It prevents due legal process, and prosecutions become impossible. All of these are quite well-known objections to torture, quite commonsensical objections to torture, and the Senate report provides a very compelling case that these were indeed the case. It shows that this happened and that it happened to a quite extraordinary degree. In some of the public debates around torture, an argument for torture is made in response to a dilemma for which the resort to torture is presented as a regrettable expediency. Torture is said to be justified in such situations because it's balanced against an even worse alternative. The well-known example that is often used is the so-called ticking bomb scenario. In this scenario, it's suggested that security forces might know about a bomb that is set to explode, with the very likely loss of many innocent lives. In many cases, the innocence of potential victims is reinforced by the supposed location of the hypothetical bomb in a school or similar target. And in such a case, if a terrorist or criminal would only disclose the location of the bomb through torture, then it's suggested that torture would be justified as a last resort to save innocent lives. Now, this type of argument sets aside the ethical principles that oppose torture on any grounds and ignores or seeks to suspend the legal principles which should prevent it in any circumstances. Instead, the argument is pragmatic and asks for a decision between two admitted evils. For many people, framing the decision in this way provides a sufficient pragmatic justification for torture. And for this reason, some opponents of torture caution against basing opposition to torture on the pragmatic grounds that torture is ineffective. They argue that resorting to this argument might be taken as tacit justification that if torture was effective, then it would be okay. They therefore suggest that it's better to argue against torture on more principled grounds, either in terms that it is always ethically wrong or that it is always and absolutely prescribed under international law. To my mind, the objections to torture that come from ethical or legal principles are indeed compelling in their own right. But I don't see why alongside these there cannot also be strong pragmatic arguments that torture is also ineffective for intelligence. The fact that torture is ineffective for intelligence, because any information given during torture is unreliable, has been apparent for as long as torture has been used. The possibility that someone subjected to torture may fabricate information is obvious. In most cases, torture is an effective way to get people to talk, but it's not a reliable way to get accurate information. It is not that torture cannot get any information, it's that it usually gets too much. A torture victim is motivated to tell the torturer whatever the torturer wishes to hear. In some cases, information extracted under torture might be true, but in many cases it won't be. For example, if the victim doesn't have the information, they have good reason to make something up. I think most of us would. Or in some cases, a person subjected to torture might have the information but might choose to lie about it. The point is that although torture can be used to get information, it's bound to get a lot of inaccurate information, and although it can also get accurate information, it has no reliable way of discerning the inaccurate from the accurate. In this sense, it's too indiscriminate to be effective. Now, this problem with torture is so obvious that it's hard to imagine how it could elude an intelligence agency, and in fact, as already noted, the CIA were well aware of this. This raises a question, then, as to why torture was used. Was it simply a woefully misguided attempt to do something that would obviously never work? Or should deeper questions be asked about why torture was used? Might the programme reflect an alternative objective? I want to come back to this shortly, but before doing so, I would suggest to you that the report is important because it sheds light on what sort of balance there is between useful and useless information gathered through torture. The picture the report offers is not that most information given under torture is actionable intelligence, and that exceptions to this are unusual. It's not even a matter of roughly even 50-50 balance. It's not even that most information is inactionable, but a minority, or even just some, is actionable. The report indicates that in a 6-year period, no information was actionable. The report carefully reviews each of 119 known individuals who were held in CIA custody, including detailed reviews of those cases that the CIA identified and publicised as evidence of its success. And after doing so, the report concludes that in none of these is there evidence of actionable intelligence. This is a staggering conclusion. Even given the obvious weakness of torture as an indiscriminate technique, the law of averages might be expected to show some results. For a 6-year torture program to fail to gather a single piece of actionable intelligence from 119 individuals is an amazing record of failure. To my mind, it should strengthen the position of those who want to argue that torture is not just wrong, it's also ineffective for intelligence. The report indicates that the torture program was ineffective beyond the wildest parody of just how ineffective any government might be. What would we make of a program or organisation that received such generous government resourcing for 6 years, yet failed to produce even one example of what it was meant to be doing? It might seem the debate in the US on the legitimacy of torture is now over. President Obama signed an order in January 2009 which prohibited the CIA from holding detainees other than on a short-term transitory basis and limited authorization techniques to those recognised in the Army Field Manual. However, Feinstein points out these limitations are not part of US law and could be overturned by a future president with a stroke of the pen. They should therefore be enshrined in legislation, she says. This is salutary, given that in the current Republican leadership contest for the 2016 presidential election, some candidates hold open the possibility that waterboarding might be a legitimate interrogation practice. One of the lessons of torture seems to be that the consensus that torture is abhorrent only holds until the next time that it is seen to be expedient. If and when the argument resurfaces, then the report should strengthen the case of those who wish to argue that torture is not just unethical and illegal, but also extraordinarily ineffective. Any future debate at how to respond to ticking bombs should include this 119-0 statistic, and the fact that positive rapport building between interrogators and detainees has been demonstrated to have much better success, a point reinforced by the report. To say that the CIA program had a bad record would be an extreme understatement. It's not just bad, it is such catastrophically poor performance that it suggests that something else is going on. The likelihood that something else is going on will come as no surprise to anyone who is familiar with studies of torture in other contexts. My own awareness of these dynamics developed through study of torture practices adopted by authoritarian regimes in Latin America, especially between the late 1960s and to the 1980s. This includes military regimes in Brazil between 1964 and 85, Chile between 1973 and 89, Argentina between 1976 and 83, as well as the regimes in El Salvador and Guatemala in the 70s and 80s, which were either led by the military or the military were behind the scenes pulling the strings. The monument in this slide is to torture victims in Brazil and was erected in Recife as a memorial to political prisoners. It features this statue as its centrepiece. It seems appropriate to look at the Senate report alongside these Latin American reports this evening for two reasons. First, because in the same month that the Senate report was released, a major report by Brazil's National Truth Commission was also released. This 2,000-page report was the culmination of nearly 3 years of official inquiry. It offers a detailed investigation of abuses by the military dictatorship, including killings, torture, sexual violence, and forced disappearance. It also recommended that those responsible be punished, or at least held accountable under law, despite a 1979 amnesty law that blocked these prosecutions. A second reason for looking at the CIA program alongside Latin America is that there is good evidence that the US actively helped security forces in Latin America to develop their torture programs, beginning with the Brazilian military in the 1960s, and then with Brazilian help exporting this and expanding it to other countries in the 1970s. I've not yet had a chance to look at the Brazilian National Truth Commission report, but an earlier report on torture in Brazil by the Archdiocese of Sao Paulo, with support from the World Council of Churches, provides detailed documentation which are actually based on military records. And there's a whole story as to how the group were able to get those military records. But what it indicates, along with other studies of torture in Latin America, is at least 3 important lessons about what I'm calling the politics of torture, and which I want to share with you this evening. The first of these is that torture can be used to break down and then rebuild the prisoner. Torture practices often combined physical punishments with psychological punishments. In many cases, the psychological punishments were reported as harder to endure and also longer lasting in their effects. Psychological torture often involved humiliation and efforts to undermine the victim's sense of dignity and self-worth. Often torture sought to erode the victim's sense of personal identity. The effect of this was to reduce their resilience and make them increasingly amenable to control by the torturer. Torture could therefore be used to break the prisoner and force them to say or do whatever the torturer wishes them to do. The complete submission of the torture victim to the torturer is often one of the goals. From the torturer's perspective, it can be seen as breaking down of one reality in which the victim and the torturer are in opposition, and then replacing this with a new reality and a new relationship in which the victim has been fully won over to the side of the torturer. There has been interesting work on how this sense of power and apparent restoration of harmony might satisfy a distorted sense of need for authoritarian regimes. The Torture of Theon Greyjoy by Ramsay Snow in the TV series Games of Thrones presents an extreme example of precisely this relationship. In breaking the prisoner down in order to rebuild them in a new way, Latin American torturers often sought to shift the blame for the abuses away from themselves and onto the prisoner. This could be done by constantly telling the prisoner that he or she was really responsible, since he or she had chosen to act against the state. In some cases, the torturer could also blame the prisoner for making the continued torture necessary. Torturers told prisoners they were prolonging their own mistreatment by resisting the torture, and that they could make it stop by accepting the torturer's power and accommodating the torturer's wishes. The Senate report, although it does not go into detail on this, certainly suggests that achieving total control, which is a quote from the report, total control of detainees was one of the prominent features of the CIA program. The second feature from Latin America relates to the target of torture. This is because in many countries, the logic behind torture was state terror rather than intelligence. Often detainees had little or no information to offer, but this did not matter since torture was not designed to discover information but to intimidate wider society. Torture was usually conducted in secret, and this created an uncertainty and mystique around it. This uncertainty often added to the traumatic impact torture practices had on the wider public. Doubt and uncertainty over exactly what was happening both fed a sense of fear in wider society and contributed to a sense of paralysis and indecision that undermined effective political opposition. Both of these made organised opposition to the regime more difficult. In addition, in at least some cases, it appears that torture and other human rights abuses against alleged opponents of the regime were also intended to send a message to other members of the military that they too would be subjected to similar treatment should they oppose the ruling group. This suggestion has been made especially in the case of Augusto Pinochet's so-called Caravan of Death. In this, one of Pinochet's trusted commanders toured the country in a helicopter shortly after the 1973 coup and selected targets for execution. These were people who had been arrested or seized in the days after the coup and were being held in military custody. According to witnesses, minimal effort was made to interrogate them or assess what information they might have. Instead, they were simply executed. And the interpretation of this was Pinochet's trusted commander sending a message to the military troops rather than just the civilian population. Now, this political dimension of torture in Latin America, in which its purpose was primarily to send a message to others, provides a second lesson for any assessment of the CIA program. To what extent was its primary purpose, intentionally or otherwise, more about sending a message to the world and to any potential enemies that hostile activities against the US could expect harsh punishment? The Senate committee report points out that the impact of the program did deep damage to the US and its standing in the world. To understand why the CIA resorted to torture, when they themselves knew it was unlikely to produce actionable intelligence, suggests a political reason along these lines. Torture would probably not help get intelligence, but it sent a political message that violence against the US would be met with extreme counter-violence. A third lesson from Latin America is that despite the obvious problems that torture had as an instrument for gathering intelligence, it was nonetheless highly successful in another area, and that is in creating confessions. Even the most determined prisoner would find it difficult to resist repeated torture. Over time, prisoners were likely to tell the torturer whatever they thought the torturer wished to hear, and there was a whole process whereby this was facilitated. The prisoner was broken down and then encouraged to take on a new form where they offered confession. If the prisoner had significant information, then there was a good chance that they would divulge this. The challenge was not to share anything on comrades within the first 24 or 48 hours, is what some Latin American activists reported, so as to give the others a chance to hide or escape. This target for a period of silence was recognition that most people could not expect to hold out against torture for long, and were likely to eventually share whatever they knew. One of the interesting sidelines in the Senate report is the apparent ability of Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, who is usually referred to as KSM, to withhold information despite very severe torture. In a number of instances, apparently, he initially held information from interrogators until it became clear that the CIA had learnt it from another source, after which he no longer needed to remain silent. For prisoners in Latin America, this sort of resistance was usually too difficult. Torture quickly destroyed their body and soul and made them willing to do or say anything that would make the torture stop. Since what the torturer wanted above all was usually a confession, this is exactly what the prisoner usually gave. Torture was a very poor tool for reliable intelligence, but it's a very powerful tool for confessions. And confessions were important for a number of reasons. First and foremost, they seemed to justify the torture. For the torturer himself, or occasionally herself, most torturers were men, the confession proved that they had done their job and exposed a subversive. For the superiors of the torturer, in the security forces, in the military, or in the political administration, the confession could then be used to justify their policies and to widen their work. It proved, in fact, that the threat of subversion was real and there was a need for a more aggressive response. This strengthened their arguments for greater resourcing and for more freedom to conduct their work without interference from the legal system or human rights advocates. A constant stream of confessions also made an impact on public opinion. Confessions provided evidence, or at least the appearance of evidence, to reassure the public that authoritarian measures were necessary, that the country really was under a sustained attack from subversives, and that the military and security forces were the only organisations who were willing and able to defend the country. Recognising the success of torture techniques in the creation of confessions is a critical step for understanding how torture can both fail and succeed at the same time. Whilst it inevitably fails to get intelligence, it can nonetheless be relied upon to consistently generate the confessions that justify its use. Moreover, very often these confessions will name others and thus provide further suspects who can be interrogated, tortured, and in due course are likely to confess whatever is needed from them, thus establishing a self-reinforcing circle of apparent success that expands and expands, but is ultimately unsustainable. I've not yet done a study of the Senate Committee report in terms of confession, but in light of what studies of torture in Latin America tell us, it would be an obvious issue to look at. In a number of places, the Senate Committee mentions detainees who confessed to things under torture and then subsequently retracted them. And these cases could be looked at in more detail. To what extent confessions took precedence over intelligence in the CIA program therefore deserves careful scrutiny. It would not be unusual if it did, and it might explain why the results on intelligence were so poor. But this is not something the report addresses and so requires further inquiry. However, one issue that the report does mention, finding 13 on the sheet in front of you, might have a bearing on this. It's that two consultants that the CIA subcontracted the program out to both had a program in the US SERE program. SERE stands for Survival, Evasion, Resistance and Escape. The SERE program was originally a response to the mistreatment of US prisoners by North Korea in the Korean War. A number of US prisoners was presented on Korean television to denounce the war and the US. In their appearance and speech, it seemed that these prisoners were acting as propaganda mouthpieces for their captors, and they had been subjected to what came to be known as brainwashing during their detention. The SERE program was developed with the intention of helping future US personnel resist brainwashing. As part of the SERE training, US personnel were first subjected to harsh mistreatment, which was designed to break them down and make them compliant to their supposed captors. The program was then intended to train them into how to resist this breakdown process. Although SERE was designed to be training against the psychological impact of torture, at different points the torture techniques that it used were also adopted by other US agencies for interrogation of prisoners. When the CIA found itself in charge of a dramatically extended interrogation program, they were encouraged by Vice President Dick Cheney to adopt a more aggressive stance in their interrogations. The report says that the White House did not authorize CIA torture, but Cheney's comments during an interview on NBC television 5 days after 9/11, the words, quote, "We also have to work, though, sort of the dark side, if you will," provided encouragement to move in this direction. Faced with this situation, it seems the CIA turned to the SERE program to give ideas on what torture techniques could be used against prisoners and how to use them. The two consultants it brought in were both involved with SERE and drew on it extensively to develop CIA interrogations. They seem to have given no attention that SERE torture techniques were designed to get propaganda confessions rather than accurate intelligence. To what extent this helps explain how the programme failed so badly as a source of intelligence, we can't go into further this evening, but I do think it needs to be looked at. Even if the CIA did not intend to do so, they created a programme that was very likely to replicate the experiences of other countries in prioritising confessions over information. So let me draw these 3 points together, the lessons from Latin America. First, torture typically combines physical and psychological punishment, which together attack both the outer body and the inner health of the victims. Severe torture can destroy the victim's own sense of identity and make the victim entirely submissive to the torturer, who can then rebuild the victim's sense of identity and character in a way that suits them. As part of this process, torturers often seek to transfer the blame and responsibility for what they were doing from themselves to the victim, repeating to the victim that they have only themselves to blame. Second, the target for torture was not limited to the individual detainee who was subjected to it, but served a much wider purpose to threaten and even terrorise others that they might also be subjected to the same mistreatment, and therefore should also submit themselves to the power of the authorities. Third, although torture is a very poor instrument for deriving intelligence, it's a very reliable instrument for creating confessions, especially when prisoners become broken and submissive. The confessions themselves are not reliable, but in many ways this does not matter. Even unreliable confessions serve a useful political purpose in justifying the torture programme, because they showed, or at least they appeared to show, that the threat to the state was real. And I would suggest that these 3 lessons from torture in Latin American regimes help explain why a CIA torture programme, which was so ineffective for intelligence, could nonetheless be sustained for 6 years as a triumphant success. Essentially, you have to understand the politics involved. Finally, this evening, I want to try and link this discussion to the mistreatment of Archibald Baxter and other conscientious objectors in World War I, and to ask what light it might shed on their mistreatment. Baxter's book, We Will Not Cease, describes how in 1917, when Baxter was 35 years old, he was taken from his home and handed over to military authorities, taken to Trentham near Wellington. The camp commander, seemingly acting on his own initiative and perhaps to reduce the numbers in the camp, gave orders that objectors who were not excused through prior membership of a pacifist religious denomination, in other words, people who before the start of the war were members of a group of which this was a recognised religious principle, should be sent to the Western Front despite their objections, and even if their objections were based on religious principles. Baxter and 13 other objectors, including 2 of his brothers, were shipped to Plymouth via Cape Town. After time in detention on Salisbury Plain, they were then sent to France, near the border between France and Germany. When Baxter still refused to follow military orders, he was sentenced to 28 days of field punishment number 1. Initially, he was sent to a nearby punishment compound for this, but when the soldiers at this compound refused to carry out the field punishment, he was moved to a second nearby punishment compound. Field punishment compounds accompanied troops and were used for punishment purposes. Field punishment 1 was the more severe punishment. Field punishment 2 was a slightly less severe punishment. Field punishment number 1, or FP1, had been introduced by the British Army in 1881 to replace flogging as the standard punishment for breaches of military discipline. During World War I, it was used over 60,000 times, and the military practice of punishment by securing soldiers to fixed objects was not abolished until the 1920s. And even then, I think it was only abolished for British soldiers. It was still used by the British in India. A total of 28 days was supposed to be the most that a commanding officer could order for field punishment. By contrast, a court-martial could order up to 90 days. Field punishment 1 involves securing the prisoner to be punished to a fence or stake using handcuffs or ropes, and then leaving him to stand for hours. The expectation seems to have been that a prisoner would be secured this way for up to 3 out of every 4 days, which amounted to 21 days of the 28, though there was probably little that could be done if this was exceeded. The 2014 television film, Field Punishment No. 1, provides a graphic sense of the harshness of Baxter's field punishment, based on Baxter's description of it in We Will Not Cease. And I'll take this from the book. "Righto," the sergeant said. "Come along, I've got my orders." He took me over to the poles, which were willow stumps 6 to 8 inches in diameter and twice the height of a man, and placed me against one of them. It was inclined forward out of perpendicular. Almost always afterwards, he picked the same one for me. I stood with my back to it, and he tied me to it by the ankles, knees, and wrists. He was an expert at the job, and he knew how to pull and strain at the ropes till they cut into the flesh and completely stopped the circulation. When I was taken off, my hands were always black with congested blood. My hands were taken round behind the pole, tied together, and pulled well up it, straining and cramping the muscles and forcing them into an unnatural position. Most knots will slacken a little after a time, but his never did. The slope of the post brought me into a hanging position, causing a large part of my weight to come onto my arms, and I could get no proper grip with the feet on the ground as it was worn away around the pole, and my toes were consequently much lower than my heels. I was strained so tightly up against the pole that I was unable to move body or limbs a fraction of an inch. Earlier in the war, men undergoing this form of punishment were tied with their arms outstretched, hence the name of crucifixion. Later, they were more often tied to a single upright, probably to avoid the likeness of a cross, but the name stuck. A few minutes after the sergeant had left me, I began to think of the length of my sentence, and it rose up before me like a mountain. The pain grew steadily worse, until by the end of half an hour, it seemed absolutely unendurable. Between my set teeth, I said, "Oh God, this is too much, I can't bear it." But I could not allow myself the relief of groaning, as I did not want to give the guards the satisfaction of hearing me. The mental effect was almost as frightful as the physical. I felt I was going mad, that I should be stuck up on a pole suffering this frightful torture, a human scarecrow for men to stare at and wonder at, seemed part of some impossible nightmare that could not continue. At the very worst, strength came to me, and I knew I would not surrender. The battle was won, and though the suffering increased rather than decreased as the days wore on, I never had to fight it again. In light of this evening's lecture and the earlier discussions of Latin American torture, there are further 3 points about field punishment No. 1 that I think are worth briefly commenting on. Firstly, field punishment No. 1 was what my colleague here at Otago, Martin Tolich, calls an exemplary punishment. Martin has done a lot of work on Baxter, including visits to Mud Farm, and I found his work very helpful in preparing for this evening's talk. I think he is absolutely right about what punishment was meant to achieve. It was intended to make an example of the prisoner. This was to signal to a wider audience that failure of discipline would not be tolerated. As discussed above, the message to a wider audience was also a feature of many Latin American tortures and may also shed light on US torture practices. Second, a key part of this exemplary purpose was to force Baxter to submit and to publicise this submission to others. As Baxter was told in his conversations with military authorities in the foreword to the book that Michael King gives, he was told very early on that it's your submission that we want, Baxter, not your service. Now, this is not quite the same as offering an explicit confession in the way that victims of torture in Latin America were often forced to do, but it has some similarity to it. It is about offering at least a tacit acknowledgement that the military authority is right after all, and you do agree with them. Third, Baxter's account makes clear that as a form of punishment, Field Punishment 1 was what we would now call a stress punishment. It's possible that the way that the punishment was used against Baxter involved much more physical stress than it was supposed to. The 1914 British Military Manual, in fact, stated that it should not be used in such a way to cause physical harm, though this does seem highly unrealistic. In any case, any constrained position maintained over a period of time can become stressful, and the position Baxter was tied in greatly increased this, as his account described. Baxter's comment on similarities between field punishment and crucifixion is also telling. It's no great surprise that the military had stopped using the outstretched arms position. Any suggestion that the British military had used Field Punishment 1 to crucify 60,000 of its own prisoners would have been a publicity disaster. There was a storm in the newspapers over a story that German soldiers had crucified a Canadian soldier. Now, although the history of this incident is contested, there seems to have been some basis to it, and there's a memorial to that, a crucified soldier from World War I. So the idea that the British military authorities would allow their standard field punishment to become identified in the public mind as a form of crucifixion was obviously highly sensitive. Yet I think Baxter is right, and others who made this link were right, to see some similarities between crucifixion and field punishment, and it's worth just mentioning those. First of all, crucifixion is itself an extreme stress position, an extreme stress torture. In fact, crucifixion by its nature is an over-stress position. The reason that death eventually results from crucifixion is because the body is forced into a constrained position where, over the long term, there's too much stress on it for it to be able to breathe. And eventually, the body loses a battle between its struggle to breathe by lifting itself up out of its constraint and then slumping back into a resting position and then having to raise itself again to breathe and slumping back down. And eventually, that overstressed position leads to death. So that's the first similarity in terms of stress position. Second similarity is that crucifixion was intended to punish not just the individual, but also to send a message to others. The Romans wanted everyone in the territories and all of their slaves to know what was likely to happen to anyone who opposed them and their authority. What I've tried to do then this evening is link this idea that field punishment, crucifixion, torture can be used to send a a public message. This connects the CIA program to the torture practices that were common in Latin America, to the field punishment to which Baxter was subjected to. And also as a reminder from a Christian faith perspective that there are links here to the central symbol of Christianity. And on this basis, I think we can affirm that just as it was wrong and ineffective to torture Baxter and other principled objectors in World War I, so it is wrong to use it in any circumstances against anybody, whatever the apparent provocation. And what I would say is it's not just wrong, but as the Senate committee report shows, it is also almost certain to be ineffective as a means of gathering meaningful intelligence. And we therefore always need to ask, so what are the politics happening here that explain that torture is being used? Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, David. I'd like to introduce myself briefly. I'm Alan Jackson. I'm the Honorary Secretary of the Archibald Baxter Memorial Trust. You've heard quite a bit about Archie's torture in the First War just recently. When I first heard about it, I asked the question, where is his memorial? And I was told there isn't one. And so it became obvious to a number of us that there ought to be one, because this is part of New Zealand's story. We do memorialise things in this country. And so a number of people, including Professor Richard Jackson, Professor Kevin Clements, Dr. Paul Sorrell here, you'll meet in a moment, and others got together to form a trust and to make a memorial in Archie's honour. I will say that every member of the trust gives their services absolutely freely. There is not a penny taken by anybody, quite the contrary. David, I think that you've given a very strong link between tonight's talk about torture and your inaugural professorial lecture, which you gave here just 2 weeks ago. We've filmed tonight's lecture, as was your IPL last week, and if you're interested, or if you've got friends who might be interested in tonight's talk, keep an eye on the Archibald Baxter website and you'll be able to find the address where the talk is being sent from. And to find the address of the website, just put Archibald Baxter Trust into Google and you've got it. We all know that the definition of insanity is keeping on doing the same thing and expecting a different result. Every school teacher knows that. And yet these people in CIA continue to do the same thing and expect to produce a better result than they already had been. And they were being funded by the government of the most powerful nation in the world, the most powerful nation that the world has ever seen. And that begs another important question that we've been raised tonight. You've also given us evidence, David, of why, statistical evidence of why it was all wrong. And when we're having arguments, whether it's in the schoolyard, round the table, or wherever, we always need evidence to back up our argument. And you've given us that evidence par excellence tonight. There wouldn't be very many of us that would have a look at that huge report. And so we're grateful to you for taking the time for all of that. We know that bullying is wrong. And we know, because we've got some people from a school audience here tonight, that there is such a thing as schoolyard bullying and cyberbullying, and we know about the effect of that in the newspapers. It makes no difference whether we're talking about Archie, the CIA, Guantanamo Bay, Abu Ghraib, or the schoolyard. It's always wrong. And so what we need is a force for peace, for the alternative, and that's very much what we're all about here tonight. I'd like to ask Dr. Paul Sorrell, who's written a book on the Otago Peninsula, if he'd please come forward and present it to Dr. Toombs, Professor Toombs, by way of saying thank you for his address tonight.
Thank you very much.
And as was said earlier, part of the Trust's work is to promote a school essay competition. And you can see from the material on the desk here that we've got some prizes for people who've participated in that. And I'm going to ask Professor Jackson, who's no relation to me, and although I wouldn't mind him as a brother or a son, if you would please do that. And Prof. Jackson is going to read the names, and Paul Sorrell is going to take pictures, and I'm going to pass the books across.
I'll read. Okay, so in the junior category, we start with the third place winner, Victoria Williamson from Columba College.
Well done, Victoria. Congratulations.
And the second place winner was Madeline McCain from Columba College. And she's in America, apparently, so we'll give it to her at another time. And the first place winner in the junior category was Sophie O'Neill from Columba College.
Well done, Sophie. Congratulations.
In the senior category, we're starting with the highly commended Josh Scadden from Kings High.
Josh, congratulations.
And in the third place at the senior category, Lucy Patton from Waitaki Girls High.
Well done, Lucy. Congratulations. Well done.
And second place, Jodie Llewellyn from Columba College.
Well done, Jodie. Congratulations.
And first place in the senior category, Anya Gipp from Queen's High.
Wonderful. Congratulations.
Thanks very much indeed. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you, Prof. Thank you, David. And thank you all for coming along tonight. We'll see you this time next year.
Just a very quick word. If you would like to donate to the Trust, and we are very interested in hearing from you about that, you can do so either online at archibaldbaxtertrust.com, all one word, or via electronic banking, and we have some cards that you can take. And please check our Facebook page and the website for notifications of other Trust activities. And just to say that a few of us are going down to Eureka now for a drink and some food, and you're welcome to come along and join us. But thank you for coming. See you next year.